The lemon polish still clung to the air as I watched my daughter-in-law rearrange my living room like she owned it. Still, I just sipped my tea, the cup steady in my hand while she whispered to my son, she should really downsize. As their voices blended with the hum of my own home, the citrus scent soured, like something spoiled under the surface. While their boxes crept into every room, I ran my hand over the deed with my name etched in ink. The same house they called too much for one old woman was paid for in my name, not theirs. That's when I handed them the 30-day notice and kept the bigger space for myself. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Rose sat in her favorite armchair by the window, a soft knit blanket draped across her lap, the tea warm in her hands. Outside, the leaves were turning, orange, red, golden, flickering in the soft autumn light. She watched them sway in the breeze, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood. It had always been like this, peaceful, steady. But this morning, something felt off. The hushed tones in the kitchen were all wrong, an undercurrent of tension cutting through the usual morning hum. She didn't need to strain to hear them. Carla was never one for discretion. I just think she'd be happier in a smaller place, Carla said, her voice crisp, too sweet for comfort. Rose's fingers tightened around the ceramic mug, the warmth of the tea doing little to calm her rising irritation. She had been a librarian for decades. She knew when people were lying. Brian didn't respond right away. She could picture him, slouched at the table, chin resting on his hand, barely a hint of interest in his voice. He'd been like this for years, always in between jobs, always needing a place to crash. Yeah, Brian finally murmured, a sigh escaping his lips. We could actually live like adults here. Rose's grip on the mug loosened, the fine china clinking ever so slightly against the saucer. Live like adults. The words stung more than she'd expected. It wasn't the first time they'd implied she was a burden, but something about today's conversation felt different, sharper. They were planning something. Carla's voice grew more insistent. Let's keep pushing, she said, her tone lighter now, almost sugary. She'll give in. You know she will. It's just too much house for one person. She doesn't need all this space anymore. Too much house. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. She had built this house with her husband, brick by brick, back when Brian was a boy. It had been their home, their sanctuary. And now, they wanted her out. Not because she was too old to live here, but because they wanted her gone. Out of sight, out of mind. She could hear it in Carla's voice. She wasn't concerned for Rose's well-being. She was just eager to make room for herself, for the life she thought should be hers. Rose set her tea down without a sound, the movement deliberate, steady. She didn't want them to know she'd heard every word, every subtle dig. There was no need for confrontation yet. Not yet. The kitchen door creaked open, and she didn't have to look up to know who it was. Eli. He wasn't one to make noise when he entered a room, always careful to avoid any unnecessary attention. She glanced at the hallway, and sure enough, there he stood, frozen in place, his dark eyes wide as he took in her expression. The tension in the air was palpable. Everything okay? Eli asked, his voice cautious, almost too soft. It was as if he already knew the answer but was hoping, no, praying, that he was wrong. For a brief moment, Rose thought about lying, telling him everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But she couldn't. Not with him. Not with what was happening now. She met his gaze, her own face unreadable, and in that moment, he understood. He'd seen her go through so much in the past. He'd seen how she could hold it all in, how she could stay composed in the face of every hardship. But this This was different. It wasn't just a fleeting argument or a disagreement. This was something deeper, something that cut at the very heart of her identity. Rose didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her mug again, her mind turning over what had just transpired. "Yeah, Eli," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Everything's fine." The words came out a little too quickly, a little too rehearsed. But she said them anyway, because what else was there to say? She wasn't ready to tell him everything. Not yet. He wasn't ready to hear it. Not this part, at least. Eli didn't press her, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He wasn't stupid. He knew something was off. And in that moment, Rose realized he was growing up. Really growing up. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready to shield him from the truth anymore. But that wasn't today's battle. She straightened her back, smoothing the wrinkles in her cardigan as she stood. Her movements were measured, controlled. The house was still, but inside, something was shifting. A plan was beginning to form in the quiet of her mind. She would not give in. Not to Carla, not to Brian, and not to anyone who thought they could push her out of the life she had built. The weight of it settled on her chest, heavy, like a storm gathering on the horizon. But this was just the beginning, and in the next few days, everything was going to change. Eli's gaze lingered for just a moment longer before he sighed, shoulders slumping. He didn't ask again. But as he turned to leave the room, she couldn't help but feel the quiet resolve in him. Something passed between them that needed no words. They weren't going anywhere. Neither of them. Not yet. Not ever. The door to the kitchen closed softly behind Eli, and the house returned to its quiet rhythm. But Rose knew, deep down, that something had shifted, and it wasn't just the air outside. The kitchen was quiet now, the tension dissipating into the ordinary sounds of the house settling. The leaves outside fluttered in the soft wind, casting gentle shadows on the wall. Rose sat at the small wooden desk in the corner, the deed to the house spread out in front of her, the paper yellowing at the edges. She ran her fingers over the name on the document, Rose Taylor, and the weight of it settled heavily in her chest. This home was hers. Completely. Paid off, unencumbered by debt. No one could take it from her, not unless she let them. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze sweeping over the old family photos that lined the walls, the faces frozen in time. Brian as a boy, his wide smile frozen in a summer of long ago. The backyard, lush with green and laughter. These walls held memories, secrets, stories. And now they were a battleground. The deed was her shield, her armor. She had kept it hidden away in a drawer for years, not out of fear, but out of respect. For the life she had built, for the love that had shaped every room of this house. But now it felt like more than just a piece of paper. It was power. And power, Rose knew, was dangerous when people thought you were weak. She reached for her phone with steady hands, tapping the screen. Paulina picked up on the first ring, her voice as sharp and confident as ever. "Paulina Ross," she said, with the slightest edge of a smile in her tone, though they both knew it wasn't a social call. "It's Rose," she said. "Still have that eviction attorney contact?" There was a pause, just long enough for Paulina to understand exactly what Rose meant. Then, a dry chuckle. "Let me guess," she said. "Family?" Rose didn't respond immediately, but she could hear the amusement in Paulina's voice. She had always been able to read her so well. "Yeah," Rose finally muttered. "They think I'm a fool, but I'm not going anywhere." Her voice hardened, resolve flickering behind the words. "I'll make the call," Paulina replied, her tone suddenly businesslike. "This won't take long." As she ended the call, Rose let out a slow breath, the weight in her chest shifting to something steadier, more certain. The plan had started, and it wasn't going to stop until it was done. The sound of Eli's footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. She didn't have to look up to know he was there. She could feel his presence like a soft breeze. Her grandson had always been quiet, but there was a maturity in him now that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the way he'd watched his parents, their manipulations, their selfishness. Maybe it was just growing up. But something in him had shifted too. He poked his head around the corner, his dark eyes looking at her with that silent understanding, like he already knew what she was planning. "I'm heading outside," he said. "You need any help?" Rose smiled slightly, the corners of her mouth curling in a way that wasn't quite a grin. "You can help me with the garden," she said, her voice softer now. "The roses are starting to bloom again." Eli nodded and disappeared, his sneakers thumping softly against the hardwood floor. Rose watched him go, and for a moment she let herself think about how things had been. She used to garden with her husband, their fingers stained with dirt as they worked together in the soil. It was one of the few things that still gave her peace now. She stood up slowly, walking toward the back door. The yard, though wild with weeds and spots, still held the familiar scent of earth, of life. She could see Eli already kneeling by the rose bushes, carefully trimming away the dead branches. Rose joined him, kneeling beside him with surprising ease for her age, her fingers brushing against the soft leaves. They worked in silence for a while, side by side, as the sun cast a golden light over the yard. "Grandma," Eli said, his voice low but steady. "Are you sure about all this? What you're doing?" Rose didn't look up, but her fingers paused for a moment on the leaves of a rose bush. "I'm sure," she said. Her voice was calm, but inside, there was a storm building. "They don't get to push me out of my own home. Not this time." Eli was quiet for a long while, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his hands working alongside hers, just as they always had in the past. It felt like old times, like before everything started to fall apart. But she knew that time was gone, the world was shifting, and she had to move with it. She could hear the faint hum of a car engine in the distance, and though she didn't turn to look, she knew it was Paulina. She would be here soon. The pieces were moving, falling into place. The front door creaked open, and a moment later, Rose heard it. The unmistakable sound of the mailbox opening and closing, followed by footsteps crunching across the gravel. It was Paulina. She'd brought the next step with her, a heavy folder in hand. Rose's heart skipped a beat. The game had started, and Rose Taylor wasn't about to lose. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting the old oak table in warm golden hues. The smell of pancakes filled the air, the sizzle of butter against the skillet mingling with the distant hum of traffic from the road. Rose stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with steady hands, the rhythmic motion almost soothing. The world felt quiet, balanced, for now. Her back was to them, but she could hear them behind her, Brian and Carla, bickering quietly as they sat at the table. Their voices had an edge to them, sharp and clipped. But Rose didn't let it show. She didn't let it change her routine. Not today. "Did you look at the brochure?" Carla's voice was sugary sweet, but there was an undertone of expectation. Rose didn't rush her reply. She placed a pancake neatly on the stack, smoothing the edges with a careful hand. "It's cute," she said, her tone light, casual, like nothing at all was happening beneath the surface. Carla, still at the table, huffed. "It's more than just cute, Rose. It's practical." She paused, as though waiting for Rose to take the bait. "You'd be so much more comfortable in a smaller place." Brian, slouched at the table, chimed in with a grunt. "Yeah, it just makes sense. I mean, why keep all this space? You don't need it." Rose turned slightly, glancing at them over her shoulder. Her expression was neutral, but inside, something stirred, like a quiet storm building. They had no idea. No idea what was really happening. Just makes sense, huh? Rose murmured, half to herself, before turning back to the stove. She plated the pancakes and set them on the table with the same calm precision she always had. Her hand lingered on the platter for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the cool ceramic against her palm. She could see Carla eyeing the stack, calculating, figuring out how to maneuver, how to manipulate. But Rose didn't move. She didn't flinch. "It's a lot to think about," Rose said, her voice as serene as ever. "I'll look at it later." Brian made a noise of impatience, his fork clinking against the plate as he pushed his food around. "No need to think about it, Mom. The longer you wait, the more difficult it's going to get. We can help you, you know. Make it easy for you." Rose met his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of years of history passing between them in that silence. But she didn't respond. She just smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. Gina's message pinged on her phone. Rose's eyes flickered to it, but she didn't hurry to check it. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee, letting the aroma fill the kitchen. She knew exactly what it would say. A second ping, and this time she picked up the phone. Her fingers moved across the screen slowly as she read the message, taking her time. Lease termination notice. Undated. Ready for delivery. Rose allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The paper trail was complete. The first domino had fallen. Gina had sent the notice through, and now all that remained was timing. Carla and Brian continued to eat, oblivious to the quiet war that was unfolding. Their voices filled the air, but Rose's thoughts were far away. She wasn't really there with them. Not in the way they thought. She was already somewhere else. In the future. In the moment when they'd realize what was happening. She could almost hear their reactions in her head. Brian's incredulous disbelief. Carla's rage. It was all coming together, piece by piece. The doorbell rang, the sudden sound breaking her reverie. She set the coffee cup down with an audible clink. "Who's that?" Carla asked, glancing up from her plate, her eyes narrowing as if the interruption was an affront. Rose smiled softly, but there was something else in it now. Something predatory. Something they wouldn't catch for a while. "Must be Paulina," she said, standing up and walking toward the door. She opened it slowly, just enough to let the light from the porch spill inside. Paulina stood there, her expression unreadable but professional, as always. She was holding a thick manila envelope, and when she stepped inside, she handed it over with a quiet nod. Rose didn't hesitate to take it. "You're moving forward?" Paulina asked, her voice low, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Rose gave a small nod, barely noticeable. "It's all in motion now," she said quietly. As Paulina turned to leave, she paused at the threshold, her gaze flicking over Rose's shoulder toward the kitchen. The unmistakable sound of Carla and Brian arguing filled the house, but Rose simply stood there, unmoved, letting it all wash over her. "You'll be ready," Paulina said softly, "when the time comes." Rose smiled again. "I will be." As the door closed behind Paulina, the house felt different. The atmosphere had shifted, thickened with the unspoken. Rose stood for a moment longer, letting the weight of the envelope in her hands settle in her mind. She could almost hear the ticking of the clock, counting down to the moment when everything would change. She walked back to the table, sitting down with a slow, deliberate movement. Carla was still talking, her voice rising in frustration as Brian mumbled in response. Rose didn't look at them. She simply sipped her coffee, the warmth filling her from the inside out. It was time. The house had never felt quite this quiet. Even the walls, thick with memories, seemed to hold their breath. Rose sat at the small desk again. Papers spread out before her, the cluttered surface a stark contrast to the calm facade she had perfected over the years. Her pen moved methodically, the scratch of ink on paper sounding louder than it had any right to in the silence of the room. She was documenting everything. Every utility bill, every shift in room usage, every comment, every glance. The mundane, the subtle, the things people thought wouldn't matter. They did. They all mattered. Every single thing. She glanced over at the pile of boxes in the living room, now starting to crowd out the space she had once filled with books. Her quiet comfort. Carla had begun her assault on the house, moving things out, clearing surfaces as if her future depended on it. But Rose had seen it before. She knew what Carla was trying to do, create space. But Rose wasn't going to let that happen. Not like this. Her eyes flickered to the phone on the table. A message from Gina, just as steady and unwavering as always. Start the paper trail. It matters. The words were simple, but they held weight. Rose had taken them to heart. Every bill, every document was a piece in the puzzle. The quiet foundation of something bigger. Outside the window, the world was calm, but inside things were slowly unraveling. Rose felt a twinge of guilt as her hand hovered over the next form, the next record. She'd never wanted to be this person, the one who quietly plotted, who kept records, who made sure that every small transgression was marked. But she had no choice. They were giving her no choice. The sound of shuffling from the living room pulled her back. Carla, of course, was still working. The boxes were piling up in the middle of the floor, but they were starting to spill out. Slowly, methodically. Rose rose from the desk and walked into the hallway, moving silently, deliberately. She didn't want to disturb Carla yet. She needed time, time to finish what had begun. Carla didn't even look up when Rose walked into the room. Instead, she simply grabbed another handful of things, heaving them toward the living room door with a gruff sigh. Rose watched her for a moment, calculating. With a soft click of the door, she disappeared into the garage, carrying the box without hesitation. She'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for Carla to push the boundaries, to show her hand. With a quiet determination, Rose began to move the boxes out of sight, into the garage, away from the spaces where they didn't belong. It was as if she were reclaiming her own territory, one piece at a time. Each box, each trinket, each scrap of paper was a reminder of who was really in charge. As she moved the last of the boxes into the corner, she heard Brian's voice from the hallway. "Mom, we're trying to create space," he said, his tone full of that familiar, almost practiced impatience. Rose paused for a beat before turning slowly, her gaze steady. She gave him a look that was calm and composed, but something darker lingered behind her eyes. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was simply resolute. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet, almost casual. "I know exactly what you're doing." Brian didn't answer immediately, but she could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to say anything like that. He'd always underestimated her, the same way Carla had. Rose didn't let it show, but she could feel the shift inside her, a quiet strength that was growing with every day that passed. She had always been the silent observer, the one who let things happen around her. But that was over now. "Mom," Brian began again, but Rose held up a hand. It wasn't a gesture of authority. It wasn't even one of command. It was simply a statement, a pause. "I don't need your help," she said, the words like a soft breeze, cool and firm. "Not in this. I know what's best for me." Brian, still standing there in the doorway, looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in a long time. The realization seemed to hit him, slow but steady. Rose wasn't the same woman she'd once been. She wasn't the person who could be easily pushed aside. The room grew still, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to change. And then, Just as quietly as it had begun, the moment passed. Brian muttered something under his breath, but Rose didn't listen. She was already walking back to the kitchen, already moving forward, already knowing what needed to be done next. She returned to the desk, sitting down with an air of finality. The papers were all there, the records, the evidence. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. But even as she glanced at the stack of documents, she couldn't help but feel that the real war had only just begun. They hadn't seen it yet. They hadn't seen the lines she was drawing. Quiet, invisible, but powerful. But they would. Soon enough. And when they did, they'd realize that the one thing they hadn't accounted for was Rose Taylor's resolve. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The doorbell rang again. The sound echoed through the house, carrying the weight of everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. It was time. The air in the house was thick with tension as Rose walked toward the kitchen. Every step was measured, purposeful, like the quiet before a storm. She held the notice in her hand, the words printed in clean, cold type, 30-day notice to vacate. The paper felt heavy, like it carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Every minute she'd spent in silence, every record she'd kept, every strategy she'd laid out, it had all led to this. She walked through the house slowly, the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floor a steady rhythm. Carla was in the living room again, moving boxes with exaggerated care. Her hands shook slightly as she rearranged the clutter. And Rose could see the faint flicker of panic beneath her calm exterior. She'd been so sure, so certain that Rose would simply bow out, but Rose wasn't about to let that happen. "Mom?" Brian's voice came from behind her, a half-hearted attempt to get her attention. "Where are you going with that?" Rose didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stopped at the edge of the living room, where Carla stood, her back turned, packing up Rose's belongings like she was already making herself at home in someone else's space. Rose's hand tightened around the notice in her grasp. It was time. With a soft sigh, she placed the notice on the arm of the couch, just within Carla's reach. "What's this?" Carla asked, her voice laced with suspicion. She glanced at the paper, then back at Rose, her expression hardening. Brian entered the room then, his brow furrowing as he noticed the paper. He approached, his pace quickening when he saw the words clearly printed on the top. Rose stepped back slightly, watching as both of them read the notice in stunned silence. "You're kicking us out?" Brian asked, his voice rising in disbelief. The words sounded almost like a challenge. He couldn't seem to process what was happening, even though the evidence was right in front of him. Carla, her face flushed with frustration, whipped around to face Rose. "Are you serious?" she demanded, her tone sharp, disbelieving. She tried to mask the growing panic behind her anger, but it was clear. The walls they had been so carefully building around Rose were crumbling. Rose's gaze never wavered. Her back straightened, her posture unwavering as she calmly folded her arms across her chest. Her eyes met Carla's, steady and unblinking. "Completely," she said, her voice even, almost serene. There was no hesitation, no softness in her words. The decision had been made long before the paper had even been printed. Carla took a step back, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words, but nothing came. Brian, still standing beside her, blinked rapidly, his disbelief shifting into something more palpable. Outrage, maybe? Or fear? Or both? "This is ridiculous," Brian muttered, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You can't just throw us out like this. This is our family home." Rose raised an eyebrow at him, her lips curling into the smallest, most deliberate smile. "It was your family home, Brian," she said, the words heavy with years of unspoken hurt. "But I don't need you here. Not anymore." Carla's eyes widened as if she hadn't expected this kind of directness from Rose. She opened her mouth again, but no words came. Instead, she glanced at Brian, looking for an ally, but the expression on his face, frozen, conflicted, told her everything. He was still trying to process what had just happened. Rose didn't move. She didn't flinch at their reactions. The years of being pushed aside, of tolerating their manipulation and greed, had worn her down in ways they couldn't understand. She had been quiet for too long, but not anymore. Her phone buzzed, a silent reminder of the quiet army she had built around her. She glanced at the screen. Gina. Everything's in order. No issues with the procedure. It's all legal. Rose felt a small sense of satisfaction ripple through her. Everything had been done by the book. Gina had been methodical, professional. There would be no legal loopholes, no way out. Brian's eyes narrowed as he watched Rose, his expression shifting from disbelief to something colder. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat, his words filled with venom. "You can't do this to us. We're family." Rose let his words hang in the air, but she wasn't moved by them. Family. That word had never meant what he thought it did. Not anymore. Eli appeared at the doorway, his presence a quiet anchor amidst the storm. He said nothing at first, just stood there, watching. His expression neutral. But then he did something that Rose hadn't expected. He nodded. Just a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it spoke volumes. He understood. Rose's heart swelled just slightly, knowing that Eli, her quiet, thoughtful grandson, had witnessed the whole exchange. He knew what was happening, and he wasn't afraid. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've drawn my line in the sand, and this time, you're the ones who are crossing it." The room fell into an eerie silence as Brian and Carla processed her words. For the first time, they realized she wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a temporary power play. This was Rose taking back control. As the silence stretched, Rose felt something shift. The fight had just begun, but it was hers to win. And she was ready. The house. Once warm with laughter and the hum of daily life, now felt like a battlefield. Rose had barely finished closing the door behind her, locking it with deliberate slowness, when the shouting began. Brian's voice rose first, a low growl of frustration. "You're breaking up the family, you know that. You've always been the one holding us together, but now you're throwing us out. After everything we've done for you." His words carried through the house, bouncing off the walls with an anger that felt out of place in these familiar spaces. Rose stood in the hallway, unmoving, listening to the rage build. She knew Brian. She knew how he would twist the narrative. He always had, making himself the victim, even as he took everything for granted. He was good at it. But this time, she wasn't falling for it. This time, he didn't get to rewrite her story. She reached into her pocket for her phone. One click, and she was recording. It was simple, discreet. A click of a button, and all of his words were captured. The recording clicked on as he raged, his voice rising in pitch. "You want to be the villain? Fine. You want to pretend like this is all about your independence? Then do it. But don't act like we're the ones who've wronged you, Rose." His words twisted in the air, growing louder and more distorted, each one aimed like an arrow. "This is our family, Mom. You're just throwing us away. We've sacrificed for you, and now this is what we get?" Carla's voice joined the fray, sharp and nasally. She had been silent at first, but her fury came rushing out. "You can't just do this. You don't get to decide, Rose. I'm not going to let you destroy everything." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of something hitting the floor with a sharp crack, probably a mug. Carla's cries began immediately, loud and ragged. They weren't the soft, careful sobs of someone truly mourning. They were the sharp, accusing cries of someone who was used to getting their way and couldn't process that the tables had turned. "Why, Rose?" she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this to us? We've done nothing wrong." "Nothing." Rose didn't flinch. She didn't move. Instead, she kept recording, her fingers steady as she captured the chaos. She could hear Carla's voice, breaking over every word, demanding attention in the way only Carla knew how. And through it all, Rose remained silent. Her silence was her weapon now. Every raised voice, every tear-soaked plea, only fueled the fire inside her. They didn't understand what it took for her to get here, to stand in this room, to hold her ground. But she wouldn't let their desperation pull her back into their web. The kitchen door slammed open, and Carla's hysterical wail cut through the silence like a blade. Rose didn't flinch, didn't react. She simply kept the phone at her side, her thumb pressing lightly on the record button. "Carla, stop," Brian said, his voice sharp and edged with frustration. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. She's doing this on purpose." But Carla wouldn't stop. She fell to the kitchen floor in a heap, her sobs now coming in full waves, as though she thought her tears could drown the situation, change the inevitable. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body heaving with emotion. The theater of it was almost too much to watch, but Rose didn't turn away. She couldn't afford to. "I'll show the world what she's doing." Carla's voice broke through her sobs. "I'll post about it. I'll make sure everyone knows how cold-hearted she is." The mention of social media struck Rose like a jolt. Carla was going to go public with this, twist it, frame her as the villain, paint herself as the victim. Rose was already one step ahead. She had seen Carla's posts before, those vague, passive-aggressive rants that dripped with self-pity and manipulation. It was Carla's go-to move when things didn't go her way. Rose knew it, and she was ready for it. Sure enough, just an hour later, Rose's phone buzzed. Carla had posted something on Facebook. It was a long, tearful status update, full of hashtags like non-family first and heartbroken. Carla's words painted Rose as a cruel, selfish woman who, after everything, had kicked her family to the curb. A comment section quickly filled with sympathetic replies, all singing the praises of how brave Carla was to endure such a harsh betrayal. Rose could hear Paulina's voice in her head, smooth and assured. "Let them dig the sympathy hole deeper. It'll make it easier for you later," she had said just days before, when they'd talked about Carla's tendency to play the victim. Paulina was right. The more Carla ranted, the more she revealed her true colors. And each word, each post, was another piece of the trap that was slowly closing around her. Rose set the phone down with a small, satisfied smile. She had everything she needed now. The house was still, except for the muffled sobs coming from the kitchen, but Rose felt an odd sense of calm wash over her. She was moving through this with the precision of a chess player, and they had no idea. The next steps were already in motion. She was taking control of her life, and nothing, not their threats, not their tears, would stop her. As the door to the kitchen opened again and Brian's voice, tense with fury, filled the air, Rose stood up slowly. She wasn't going anywhere. This was just the beginning, and she was ready. The knock on the door was firm, but not forceful. Professional, even. Rose stood at the entryway for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the doorknob, her breath calm. She already knew who it was. The weight of everything she'd been preparing for had come to this point, the moment of reckoning. She opened the door to find an agent from Adult Protective Services, standing in the late morning light, clipboard in hand. He was a tall man, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a dark suit that seemed too formal for a visit like this. His eyes were kind but unreadable, scanning her face quickly before he stepped forward. Mrs. Taylor? He asked, his voice polite, almost too neutral. That's me, Rose replied, her tone steady. She opened the door wider, gesturing for him to come inside. Please, come in. The agent stepped in, his eyes flicking to the small living room where Carla had been so dramatically crying just a few hours before. The space was tidy now, every item in place. The rooms were spotless, and Rose had taken extra care to make sure everything looked just as it should. A picture of a well-maintained home. This won't take long, the agent said, glancing over at her. I just need to go over some details and make sure everything is in order. Your son and daughter-in-law raised concerns, but we've done our due diligence. Of course, Rose replied evenly, watching him closely as he sat down at the small table in the corner. His demeanor suggested this was just another routine visit, but to Rose, it felt like a crossroads, like she was playing a part in a much larger drama. She led him to the living room, where she had already laid out the stack of documents on the coffee table. The agent glanced at the papers and then back at her, his expression neutral. Everything is here, Rose said, her voice steady. Utility bills, records of room usage, verbal exchanges. You'll find everything as it should be. I've documented everything, just as you advised. The agent nodded, clearly impressed. He flipped through the papers, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the details. Rose had kept track of everything, each phone call, every interaction, every instance where Carla or Brian had made subtle, manipulative remarks. The pattern had been clear for months now, and the more she collected, the more she realized how calculated they had been. She didn't have to explain any of it. The papers spoke for themselves. He glanced around the room again, his gaze lingering on the kitchen. You've kept a clean home, he observed, almost as if he was surprised by it. I always have, Rose said, her voice a little softer but still firm. I've never been one to let things fall into disarray. As the agent continued his inspection, Rose could hear the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen. Eli was quietly cleaning up, still a silent presence in the background. He hadn't said much during the entire ordeal, but Rose knew he was paying attention. He was learning. He was on her side. After a few more minutes of quiet paperwork, the agent looked up from his clipboard, meeting Rose's eyes directly. Everything checks out, he said, closing the folder with a soft snap. There's nothing here that indicates any neglect or mistreatment. I'll be filing my report, but it's clear to me that you're in full control of your living situation. Rose nodded slowly, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. She hadn't been sure how the visit would go, but now it was over. And it was over in her favor. I appreciate your time, Rose said, standing as the agent began to gather his things. I know it's not an easy job. No, it isn't, the agent agreed, standing up and extending his hand. But you've made it easy for me, Mrs. Taylor. I'll be closing this file today. She shook his hand, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. It was over, at least for now. The trap was set, and there was no going back for Brian and Carla. As the agent left, Rose closed the door behind him with quiet finality. She turned around, her gaze falling on Eli, who was now standing by the kitchen door. He gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet victory they had just secured together. Before Rose could fully process the moment, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, seeing Gina's name flash across the screen. She quickly answered, her voice steady but tinged with anticipation. Gina, Rose said. The agent just left. Everything went as planned. Good, Gina replied, her voice confident. I've sent the legal notice of retaliation to them. It's all in motion. They won't know what hit them. Rose allowed herself a small smile. Retaliation. It wasn't just about kicking them out anymore. It was about making sure they couldn't retaliate, making sure the damage they'd tried to inflict on her wasn't allowed to fester. She was closing every possible loophole. "I think we've made our point," Rose said quietly, her voice now laced with the weight of finality. "I don't think they'll come after me again." Gina's voice softened, though the underlying satisfaction was clear. "I agree. They're not going to win this time." Rose looked around the house, her house, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she was the one with the upper hand. She had fought, she had planned, and now the pieces were falling into place. Brian and Carla hadn't seen it coming. They hadn't understood how far she was willing to go, how much she had been willing to lose before she would stand up and take it all back. And they still didn't understand. Eli stepped forward, a slight smile on his lips. "Grandma," he said, his voice steady but full of pride. "You really did it." Rose smiled back, feeling the weight of the last few days, weeks, lift from her shoulders. "We did it, Eli," she replied softly. But deep down, Rose knew this was only the beginning. The real work, the real battle, was just getting started. Rose stood in the dim hallway, her fingers running slowly along the smooth, cool surface of the master bedroom door. It had always been a quiet room, the one place in the house where she could retreat when things became too much. But now, that room, like so many others, was about to change. The house had been hers, and it had been their home. But that was no longer the case. She had made her choice, and this was the next step. The key turned in the lock with a firm click, the metal biting into her skin as she gripped it tightly. She hadn't expected this part to be easy, but the quiet, decisive action felt like a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. She stepped back, surveying the door for a moment longer before pulling the key from the lock. She walked down the hallway, past the framed photos of family trips and birthdays. It was all so innocuous, so ordinary, but nothing was the same now. In the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed tea still lingered in the air. Rose poured herself a cup, the ritual of the quiet moment comforting as she took the mug in hand. It was time to assert control over what remained, what was hers. She had already contacted Gina, who had ensured that the changes were in full compliance with tenancy laws. The paperwork was airtight, and there was nothing left for Brian and Carla to claim. Rose took a slow sip of the tea, feeling its warmth spread through her. She could hear the distant sound of Brian's voice, rising in frustration. The usual grumbling about the state of things. "I don't have anywhere to work," he called from the living room, his voice tinged with that familiar mixture of entitlement and resentment. "Where am I supposed to go now, Mom? This isn't just about me. This is about the whole family." Rose didn't respond right away. She wasn't interested in engaging. She didn't need to justify herself. Not anymore. She had made her decision clear, and Brian's complaints were nothing more than background noise now. Carla appeared in the doorway moments later, her face flushed, her expression a mixture of indignation and desperation. "This is insane," she spat. "We're being treated like strangers in our own home. You're locking us out of our own rooms now?" Rose turned to face her, the silence between them thick and charged. Carla had always known how to push buttons, how to twist situations in her favor. But Rose wasn't going to let her anymore. "No, Carla," Rose said, her voice calm, steady. "You're not getting access to those rooms. Not anymore." Carla opened her mouth to argue, but Rose raised a hand, cutting her off. It wasn't a gesture of anger, it was just a simple, firm statement of fact. The power had shifted. The game had changed. "Everything in those rooms is mine," Rose continued. "If you want access, you'll have to go through the proper channels. You're guests here now, not residents." Carla looked at her, eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, Rose thought she might lash out, cry, scream, maybe even beg. But Carla just stood there, fists clenched at her sides. She said nothing. Rose's heart didn't race. There was no rush of triumph. But there was something more important, something quieter, taking root inside her. The last of the anxiety, the fear of losing everything, began to slip away. She was doing what needed to be done, and she wasn't turning back. As Carla finally turned and stormed off, Rose took another sip of her tea, the warm liquid comforting against the cold reality of the situation. But that wasn't the end. Not yet. Rose could already feel the tension in the air, thickening with every passing moment. Brian had said nothing else for now, but she knew he wouldn't give up easily. He would try again, and again. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. The doors were locked for a reason, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. In the next few days, things would unfold further. The house listing, a small but vital detail, had already gone live, marked as soon available by Paulina. They hadn't seen that coming. The notion of renting out the house, even temporarily, had been a final stroke. One last move to show them that Rose wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She would no longer be the victim of their schemes. But for now, there was only the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, the gentle hum of the house in the background. Rose locked the door to the office, feeling the solid click of the lock behind her. One step at a time. The courthouse loomed in front of Rose like a silent sentinel, its stone steps worn by years of people coming and going, each one carrying a piece of their own battle. Today, it was her turn. Rose walked up those steps with a quiet confidence, the papers she needed tucked securely under her arm. Beside her, Gina walked with the same purposeful stride, her calm presence like a rock against the weight of the day. There was no nervousness, no doubt in Rose's posture. This wasn't a fight she was afraid of anymore. As they entered the courthouse, Rose could hear the buzz of voices, whispers of other cases, the low murmur of people waiting their turn. It all faded away as they moved toward the courtroom, her steps slowing just slightly. "Remember," Gina said in a low voice, "stay calm. You have everything you need. Just let the facts speak for themselves." Rose nodded without responding. She didn't need to say anything. Today was about more than words. It was about the facts, the irrefutable evidence she'd carefully compiled over the past months, the hours of watching, waiting, documenting. Now it was time for everything to fall into place. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Brian and Carla were already seated at one of the tables, Carla clutching a folder in her lap like it held the key to their salvation. Rose could see the tension in their shoulders, the tightness in Brian's jaw, and the way Carla's eyes darted around the room, almost desperate for validation. As Rose and Gina took their seats, Brian glanced over at them, his eyes narrowing. He had no idea what was coming. The judge, an older man with a stern face and thick glasses, entered the room, and the noise immediately quieted. He took his seat, and the proceedings began. His voice was clear and commanding as he glanced over the case files in front of him. "Ms. Taylor, you have requested an eviction," the judge said, looking directly at Rose. "Do you have the necessary documentation?" Rose didn't hesitate. She stood up, smooth and controlled, and passed the file to the clerk, who handed it over to the judge. Her hands were steady, the weight of the papers light despite everything they represented. It had taken weeks of careful planning, hours of phone calls, and a whole lot of patience. But now, here it was, everything she had fought for, laid bare before the court. Brian's voice cut through the stillness. "Your Honor," he began, standing up, "I have a verbal agreement with my mother. We've been living here for years, and she's always said we could stay. There's no written contract, but I've got the understanding." Rose didn't react immediately, but she could feel Gina's calm presence beside her, watching with quiet intent. The judge raised an eyebrow, flipping through the papers in front of him. "And you're telling the court that this agreement was in place with no formal documentation?" the judge asked, his voice neutral but pointed. Brian shifted uncomfortably, his words starting to stumble. Well, yes, but we've lived here. It's been years and there's never been any issue before. This is all coming out of nowhere. Carla's voice joined his, her tone pleading, desperate. We've always helped Rose. She wouldn't do this to us. We're family. This is just a misunderstanding. The judge didn't respond to their protests right away. He leaned back in his chair, his glasses reflecting the light as he read through the papers. The room was deathly silent except for the soft rustle of pages, and Rose felt the tension rise, but she didn't flinch. She knew this moment was coming. She was ready. Finally, the judge looked up from the documents. His voice was quiet but firm. I've reviewed the evidence. There is no formal lease agreement, and no substantial proof of the alleged verbal agreement. However, there are several reports here, including utility bills, room usage records, and behavior documentation, which suggest a different dynamic in this home. Rose felt a quiet satisfaction swell inside her as the judge continued, his words a slow, deliberate weight that fell heavily on Brian and Carla. The proof was undeniable. Based on this evidence, I find that Ms. Taylor has full legal control of the property, and I am granting the full eviction. You have 7 days to vacate the premises. The words hung in the air, thick and final. Rose watched as the realization hit Brian and Carla, their faces falling, disbelief flooding their expressions. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He seemed to freeze, his entire body stiffening with the shock of the decision. Carla, who had been holding her breath, let out a strangled sob. Her face crumpled, and her tears began to fall, loud, bitter cries, as if the world had just collapsed beneath her. Rose remained still, her gaze unwavering as Carla's sobs filled the room. There was no triumph in her. She didn't gloat. This wasn't a victory. It was a necessary ending to a long, exhausting battle. Brian, though, seemed to regain some composure. He turned to face Rose, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and confusion. "You're doing this, Mom? After everything?" Rose met his gaze, her voice calm but resolute. "Yes, Brian. After everything." Carla collapsed into her chair, her head bowed, the weight of defeat pressing down on her. Rose said nothing more, allowing the silence to stretch. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the finality of the ruling. "You have 7 days," the judge repeated, his voice unyielding. "Good luck." As the proceedings came to an end, Rose stood, feeling the weight of her own quiet resolve. She didn't need to say anything else. The decision had been made, and Brian and Carla had no more power here. She turned to leave, Gina beside her, and as they walked out of the courtroom, Rose allowed herself one final glance at the two of them. Carla's tears and Brian's frozen expression stayed with her, but she didn't look back again. The battle was over. And now, for the first time in years, Rose Taylor could finally breathe. The sound of frantic footsteps echoed through the house as the clock ticked closer to the deadline. Rose could hear it all, the hurried scuffling, the rustle of cardboard, the quick breaths as Brian and Carla scrambled to get their things together. The house, once a place of shared history, was now nothing more than a shell of their past, stripped bare of the life they had tried to force on her. She stayed out of sight. She didn't need to see them packing. She didn't need to witness their anger, their attempts to make everything feel like it wasn't happening. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. The papers were signed, the court had ruled, and the only thing left was for them to leave. Rose didn't even flinch when she heard Carla's voice rise in frustration, cutting through the air with bitter indignation. "This is insane!" Carla snapped. "We shouldn't be packing. We shouldn't be leaving." Rose kept moving through the house, her footsteps deliberate, the air thick with a strange kind of stillness. She couldn't remember the last time it had been like this, quiet, without the undercurrent of conflict. Her fingers lightly grazed the surfaces of her things, her bookshelves, the family photos she'd carefully placed over the years, each one a reminder of a simpler time before everything had spiraled out of control. She poured herself another cup of tea. The cup felt warm against her hand, as though she were holding on to something familiar, something solid. Behind her, the house hummed with movement, the occasional crash as a box was knocked over, the scraping of furniture against the floor. Rose let it all wash over her. It wasn't her problem anymore. She had done what she needed to do. They were leaving, but Eli, her quiet, observant grandson, was the only one who seemed unaffected by the chaos. He stepped into the living room, his presence soft but noticeable, as he glanced over at her. "Grandma?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Can I still visit?" Rose met his gaze. His eyes were earnest, filled with that deep, unspoken respect he had always shown her. She felt a pang in her chest, a momentary flicker of sadness for the way things had unfolded. But she knew the answer, and her words came easily, without hesitation. "Always," she replied, her voice a steady balm against the uncertainty that hung in the air. She could see his relief, the tightness in his shoulders easing as he nodded quietly. For a moment they just stood there in silence, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. It wasn't about the house, it wasn't about the eviction, it was about the two of them, standing in the middle of the wreckage and knowing they would be okay. "Thank you," Eli whispered before he turned and walked away. Rose let the silence stretch between them, savoring the peace. She didn't need to watch Brian and Carla pack. She didn't need to see the anger in their eyes, the accusations they would no doubt hurl her way. She had given them the chance to leave quietly, and they had refused. Now they were forced to face the consequences. The front door slammed open as the movers arrived, their presence undeniable, their task simple. "We're here to load up," one of them said, his voice loud enough to pierce the tense air. Brian appeared in the hallway, his face tight, his jaw clenched in frustration. "You can't just come in here and—" "Your keys," the mover interrupted, holding out his hand. "We're scheduled to clear the place. You know the drill." Rose heard Brian mutter something under his breath, something that sounded like a low growl. But he didn't argue further. He handed over the keys without another word. Carla, who had been clinging to her defiance, watched them with wide eyes, her hands trembling as she stood frozen at the doorway of the room she once considered her own. Rose didn't even look at her. There was no need to. The movers moved with purpose, their actions swift and clinical, as they began to load the boxes Brian and Carla had hastily packed. There was no room for protest now. There was only the silence of the end of an era, the finality of the moment settling in. As the movers carried out the last of the boxes, Rose sat back down in her favorite chair, taking another sip of her tea. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the mug, her thoughts quiet but firm. She had done what she had to. It was over. The movers finished and turned toward the door, nodding respectfully as they filed out. One last glance over her shoulder and Rose stood up, the finality of the moment heavy on her shoulders. She glanced down the hallway, her gaze steady. Brian and Carla were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps they had gone to their motel. Perhaps they were standing in the yard, looking back at the house they had called home for so many years. It didn't matter anymore. The door clicked shut behind the movers, the house settling into the quiet rhythm it had known for years before the chaos began. The last box was gone. The last piece of the puzzle was in place. Rose walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the yard. Her yard, now hers again. She couldn't help but let out a small, satisfied breath. It had been a long road, but she had made it. The house was silent, but Rose wasn't. Not anymore, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The house felt different now. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of quiet that came with finality. Rose walked from room to room, her footsteps muffled against the hardwood floors, her fingers brushing the backs of chairs, the edges of shelves, the smooth surfaces of tables. Each touch felt like a soft restoration, a reaffirmation of ownership. She hadn't realized how much the noise, the constant tension, the bickering, the accusations, had filled the air until it was gone. Now, there was only peace. She stepped into the living room, the space that had once been so filled with chaos. The boxes were gone. The clutter was gone. The piles of old belongings, half-packed and left to fester in their own confusion, were no longer there to weigh her down. The room had been cleared, rearranged. There was a simplicity to the space now that felt like breathing again. The sun streamed through the window, casting long beams of light across the room, touching the new, softer arrangement of furniture. Rose hadn't realized how much it had needed change. It felt like something had shifted in the very bones of the house. The walls felt warmer, the corners not quite so shadowed. Perfect, she murmured to herself as she stood in the center of the room, the air settling around her. Paulina had come by earlier after the movers had finished. She'd helped move the furniture into a new arrangement. A few more modern pieces, a fresh perspective, and it was exactly what the house needed. Paulina was in the kitchen now, filling the space with a different kind of energy, her hands moving deftly as she took inventory of the things Rose had packed away. Rose walked in, a soft smile tugging at her lips as she watched Paulina work, completely at ease, her sharp eyes taking in the little details, things Rose would have never noticed. "It looks good, Paulina," Rose said, stepping into the kitchen. "You really did help make it feel new." Paulina gave a short nod, wiping her hands on her jeans. "It was time for a change, Rose. You can't keep everything the same forever, especially not when things get crowded." Rose met her gaze. A brief flicker of something in her eyes, a reminder of everything she had been through, everything she had reclaimed. But she didn't need to say anything. The silence between them spoke volumes. Just then, the front door creaked open, and Rose looked up to see Eli standing in the doorway, a plate of cookies in his hands. His face lit up with that familiar warmth, and for the first time in a long while, Rose felt the weight in her chest loosen. "Grandma," he said, his voice bright, "I thought you might like some cookies after all the craziness. You know, the kind with chocolate chips." Rose smiled softly as Eli placed the plate on the counter. He was still so young, but his maturity had grown with every moment he'd spent watching and learning from her. "Thank you, Eli," Rose said, pulling him into a hug. "You've been a big help, just by being here." Eli grinned, his eyes lighting up as he glanced around the room. "It feels better in here," he said with a quiet certainty, his eyes scanning the space like he could feel the shift too. Rose nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "No echoes anymore," she said softly. The words felt like a quiet tribute to what had been lost and what had been regained. They both stood there for a moment, the hum of the house surrounding them. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, Rose was startled by the soft ding of the doorbell. She stepped toward the door, Eli already running ahead to open it. When she saw Gina standing on the porch, a small bouquet of flowers in hand, she felt another wave of calm wash over her. "I thought you might like these," Gina said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as she handed over the flowers. They were simple, lilies and daisies, fresh and bright. "Thank you," Rose said, her voice warm as she took them from Gina's hands. "They're beautiful." Gina stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Looks like you're settling in," she said with a nod of approval. "Good. You deserve this piece." Rose didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The words felt heavy, unnecessary. Instead, she placed the flowers on the table and turned to look at her. I don't think I could have done it without you, Gina. All of this. She paused, her hand sweeping over the room. This is more than just a house. It's finally mine again. Gina smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. You fought for it, Rose. You always will have this. It's yours. Rose turned back to the room, taking in the light spilling over the furniture, the small corners filled with items that had been hers from the start. It felt like a home again, not just the building or the walls. The feeling in the air was different, lighter, somehow. Eli came up to her, standing beside her with a small grin. You did it, Grandma. Rose smiled back at him, a quiet, knowing smile that carried more weight than words could express. Yeah, she said, her voice low but full of finality. We did. She didn't need to look back to know that the past was behind her. This was the beginning of something new. A new chapter, a new kind of peace. And she was ready for whatever came next. The office was quiet, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting thin slats of light across the wooden desk. Rose sat in her chair, the heavy weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. It was time. Time to finally finish what she had started. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she adjusted the papers before her. The will. The final step. She had been putting it off for weeks, but now, with everything settled, it was clear. The names that had once been hers to protect, her son and daughter-in-law, no longer deserved that protection, not after everything they had done. The room was still. The house was still. There was only the soft click of the pen as she made the changes. Brian and Carla were fully removed, their names blacked out with a swift stroke. She paused for a moment, staring at the space where their names had once been. A faint sadness tugged at her heart, but it was fleeting. Quickly replaced by the resolve that had carried her through the last few months. This was right. She had made the hard decision, and now it was done. She took a deep breath and turned the page. Eli's name was written in the space where hers had once been. He was her heir now, but there were conditions. Important ones. Rose hadn't just decided to give him everything. She had learned too much over the years to leave things to chance. Education was first. Rose wanted Eli to have the chance to find his own path, to make his own way in the world. And employment? He would have to work for his inheritance, earn it the same way she had, the same way her late husband had. She smiled as she wrote those words. Eli would understand. He already had a strong work ethic. Paulina's name was next. As the executor of the estate, she would carry out Rose's wishes, ensuring that everything was handled with the same quiet professionalism that had marked the last few months. Paulina had been a rock in all of this, her no-nonsense attitude the perfect balance to Rose's quiet determination. The final touches were easy, just a few signatures, a few more minor adjustments. When Rose was done, she sat back in her chair and looked at the document, the lines of ink now set in stone. It was done. It was official. She felt a quiet satisfaction swell inside her, but there was no triumph, no victory lap. Just peace. The peace she had fought for. The peace she had earned. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk, the screen lighting up with a text. Rose hesitated for a moment before picking it up. It was from Carla. We need to talk. This isn't over. You can't just throw us out like this. Rose's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. She hadn't expected anything less from Carla, still trying to cling to whatever control she thought she had left. But there would be no more conversations, no more manipulation, no more games. She set the phone down on the desk, her fingers running over the smooth wood as she allowed the silence to settle back into the room. Now it's official. The thought lingered in her mind, and for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Just then she heard the sound of footsteps outside the door, soft and sure. Eli walked in, his face filled with that quiet maturity that had grown in him over the months. "Grandma?" he asked, his voice low but full of the same respect he had always shown her. "Are you done?" Rose smiled, the weight of everything in the room lightening with his presence. She stood up and walked over to him, holding out the will, the ink still fresh. "I'm done," she said, handing him the paper. "It's all set. You're the one who gets to carry this forward now." Eli took the paper gently, his fingers brushing against hers. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to ask for clarification. He understood. He always had. As Rose watched him look over the document, a flicker of pride moved through her. This was it. Her work was done. Now it was his turn. Eli looked up at her, his eyes steady. "You've worked so hard for this, Grandma. I'm going to make sure it means something." Rose's heart swelled. "I know you will." She stepped back, allowing the space between them to settle into a kind of quiet peace. The house was still. The sun was setting outside, casting the room in a warm glow. It felt like home again. Eli tucked the will under his arm and looked at her one last time. "You don't need to worry anymore. We're going to be okay." For the first time in years, Rose felt the weight of her past slip away, her future unfolding before her with quiet certainty. This was how it was meant to be. Everything was in its place, and as she watched Eli leave, she knew. This was the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for them both. The text from Carla sat unanswered on her phone, but Rose didn't need to reply. Her silence was all the answer they would ever need. It had been a few weeks since the court order, since the dust had settled and the weight of everything had finally shifted. Rose stood in the quiet of the living room, looking out the window at the peaceful, familiar view of the front yard. The air had softened, and everything in the house felt just right. Everything was hers again. But the change didn't end with her own sense of reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The world outside still spun, still moved, and Rose wasn't about to just let the house sit idly by. The house had always been a place for others, for family, and for laughter. But now, Rose had something new in mind. The decision had come easily. The guest house, small, quaint, was the perfect space for something new. It wasn't just about making extra income. It was about giving the space a purpose again. She wanted to bring life back into the house, but this time, on her terms. She wasn't about to sell or close the doors off. The guest house would be rented out. She didn't just want anyone, though. This wasn't just any rental. Rose had been careful, and she wasn't about to rush. She put the listing up, making sure to emphasize the qualities she wanted to see in potential tenants. She wasn't interested in people who saw this house as just another place to crash. She wanted someone who would understand what the house meant. The first family to apply stood out immediately. They were young, fresh-faced, and kind. They had a quiet honesty about them, the kind you could see in the way they spoke, the way they held themselves. They didn't walk into her home with an air of entitlement. They had no sense of expectation. They were humble, respectful. When they walked into the living room for their interview, Rose could feel something click. The man, David, was a schoolteacher. His wife, Emily, a nurse. Their young daughter, Lily, sat quietly at their feet, a coloring book in hand. There was something about them that felt right. Not perfect. No, life wasn't perfect, but real. And that was all Rose needed. "So," David said, a little nervous but sincere, "we've been looking for a place with some space, but not too much. We've heard about this neighborhood, and it just feels right." Rose smiled, nodding. "I've lived here for a long time," she said, her voice gentle. "It's been good to me. I just want someone who'll take care of it, someone who respects it." Emily smiled softly. We understand. We're looking for stability, and we want to make sure we find the right place. We'd take good care of it. Rose studied them for a moment longer, and then something inside her told her it was time. I think you'll be a good fit, she said, her words calm but full of finality. You can move in at the beginning of the month. The family's faces lit up. David's eyes brightened with genuine relief, and Emily squeezed his hand in gratitude. Thank you, David said, his voice full of sincerity. You won't regret it. Rose gave a small nod, already feeling the weight of the decision lift from her shoulders. This was right. She could already picture their little family making the house feel full again. The next step was making sure the house worked for them. Rose turned her attention to the guest house, making sure everything was ready. She knew it needed some updates. It wasn't much, but a little fresh paint, a few updates to the furniture, and it would be a perfect place for them. The transformation was quick, but meaningful. Rose knew the guest house needed life, and with that, she decided to do something extra, something that made the house feel more like a home, not just to her, but to the neighborhood. She started work on a small community library in the front yard, a project that Eli had been eager to help with. He had grown even more thoughtful since everything had settled. It was like the weight of their past had allowed him to step into his own, and now he was there with Rose, helping to build. They spent hours together, working on the wooden shelves, sanding the edges, painting the small sign that read, "Take a book, leave a book." It was simple, but it meant something. Rose could already see it. Neighbors and visitors, people coming together, using the space in a way she hadn't imagined when she first bought the house. A quiet sense of community was exactly what the house needed. And exactly what Rose had wanted all along. Eli wiped his hands on his jeans as he looked over their work. It feels right, Grandma, he said, his voice soft, but full of meaning. Rose smiled at him, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. It does, doesn't it? This is the kind of home I wanted to build. One that brings people together. And it wasn't just about the house. It was about the future. The future of her family. The future of the people she chose to have around her. With the library finished and the guest house ready for its new tenants, Rose felt a quiet peace settle around her. There was no lingering weight from the past. Brian and Carla were a memory now, and their influence was slowly fading from the walls. As Rose stepped back and looked out at the house once more, she didn't feel alone. She felt like the house had purpose again. It was the beginning of something that didn't belong to Brian, Carla, or anyone else from her past. It was hers. And now, it was more than just a place to live. It was a place to grow. And for the first time in a long while, Rose felt like everything was exactly where it needed to be. The house was quiet again, the weight of it finally lifting. Rose stood in the hallway, looking at the small, untouched drawer in the sideboard. It had once been filled with trinkets, old bills, things that didn't matter. But now, it held something else. A quiet, fleeting memory. She pulled the drawer open slowly, her fingers grazing across the edge. It was a moment of hesitation, a lingering, silent pull she hadn't expected. She lifted an old, yellowed photo from the back. It was a photo of Brian, a boy no older than Eli. He was in the yard, standing by the same tree that now cast its long shadows across the grass. His eyes were wide, full of innocence, a grin on his face that hadn't yet been hardened by life. Rose stared at it for a long time, the weight of the memory hitting her in an unexpected way. She could see it all. The sun-drenched yard, the sound of Brian's laughter echoing around the house, the simpler days before the world had turned against her. But now, all that remained was the image, a fragment of the past that had been buried under so much more. Rose sighed softly, the image in her hand feeling heavier than it had any right to be. It was a part of her history. Yes, but it was no longer her present. With a gentle movement, she placed the photo back into the drawer, closing it slowly. She didn't need to keep it on display. The past was a place she could visit when needed, but it was no longer a place to live. Eli was outside now, working with the freshly planted flowers in the garden. Rose had asked him to help with the last of the spring planting, a simple act that somehow brought the yard to life. She watched him for a moment from the window, smiling softly. The quiet rhythm of his movements calmed her, filling her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She went outside to join him, the sun warm on her back as she stepped into the yard. Eli glanced up at her and grinned. "Grandma," he said, his voice filled with that lightness that always made Rose's heart lift. "This place really is ours now, huh?" She bent down beside him, taking a handful of soil and running it between her fingers. "It is," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "It's ours." As they finished planting the last flowers, the doorbell rang. It was a soft, unassuming sound, but Rose could feel the familiar weight of it. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer the door. When she opened it, Paulina stood there, a warm smile on her face. She held a small basket in her hand, the scent of fresh bread filling the air. "I brought dinner," Paulina said with a wink, stepping inside without waiting for Rose to invite her. "It's time we had a proper meal together, don't you think?" Rose smiled, the ease of Paulina's presence a balm to the steady hum of her life. "You're right," she said, stepping aside to let Paulina in. Eli ran into the kitchen, his face lighting up at the sight of Paulina. "Are you staying for dinner?" he asked eagerly. "Of course," Paulina said with a soft laugh. "I didn't come all this way just to leave." They settled around the table as the evening unfolded. The kitchen, once full of tension, now seemed alive with laughter. Rose could see how much had changed, not just in the house, but in herself, in the people she had chosen to keep close. Later, as the meal finished, Gina knocked on the door. She stood there with a warm, approving smile, a folder in hand. "I just wanted to check in," Gina said, walking inside. She sat down at the table, the air between them comfortable, like old friends. "I've reviewed the house trust," Gina continued, her voice calm but firm. "Everything is airtight, Rose. There's nothing left to worry about. Your future, and Eli's, is secure." Rose sat back in her chair, a wave of relief washing over her. This was what she had fought for. The house was no longer just a structure. It was her life, her legacy, and now it was his too. "Thank you," Rose said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Gina smiled, leaning back in her chair. "You don't need to thank me. This was always yours, Rose. You just needed to claim it." The night drew on, the stars beginning to twinkle outside, and the house settled into a deeper peace than it had known for years. Rose sat by the window, watching the quiet landscape she had come to know again. The garden was hers now, the house was hers, and her future, their future, was finally her own. As she looked out, she saw Eli standing in the yard, his arms crossed as he gazed up at the stars. She walked over to him, her steps sure. "Everything's changed, Grandma," he said without turning around. Rose stood beside him, her eyes on the same sky. "Yes, it has," she replied, a soft smile on her lips. "But some things, like us, don't change. And that's a good thing." They stood there for a long while, side by side, watching the quiet, steady rhythm of the night. The house, the garden, the world, it all felt still, finally at peace. And for the first time in years, Rose could hear the quiet hum of contentment inside her. It wasn't just the house that was hers, it was everything. And it felt exactly the way it should. The first cool gust of fall air pushed through the open windows, carrying the scent of leaves and the faintest trace of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire. Rose stood at the window, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the sill. The breeze was a welcome change, sweeping through the house like a promise, one she hadn't dared to dream of for years. She took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The house, the one she had built, the one that had been hers for so long, now felt different. It was full again, but this time, not with chaos or manipulation. It was filled with warmth, real warmth, a warmth that could only come from having reclaimed control. As the seasons shifted outside, so had her life. She opened the window wider, letting the cool air flood the room. The soft rustling of the leaves outside was a reminder of the passage of time, and for the first time in years, Rose didn't feel tethered to the past. She felt free. Eli was in the living room, sitting at the desk he had claimed as his own, working through a stack of applications. His acceptance letter to college had arrived that morning, a moment that seemed so distant not too long ago. But here he was, growing up, moving forward. Rose watched him for a moment, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. She knew she had helped him get to this point, providing the support, the foundation, and the love that had been lacking before. He was going to make something of himself, on his own terms, with no one holding him back. The house was his to inherit, but it wasn't just the walls or the land. It was the legacy of strength, resilience, and hard-earned peace. "Grandma, look!" Eli called out, a grin spreading across his face. He held up the college brochure he had been studying, his voice full of excitement. "I think I can actually do this. I'm going to make it." Rose smiled at him, her heart swelling. "You've already made it, Eli," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've got everything you need to succeed." She turned back to the window, letting the sound of his laughter fade into the background as she reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The house, once filled with secrets and tension, was now a place of hope. It wasn't just a building. It was the place where she had stood her ground, where she had built something lasting for herself, for Eli, for the future. Outside, the garden was alive with color, flowers blooming, their bright faces turning toward the sun. The new tenants had taken to the yard with care, planting more flowers along the walkway, bringing the house to life in a way Rose hadn't expected. The small community library, which she and Eli had built together, was beginning to see visitors, neighbors stopping by to share books and stories. The house was becoming a hub of activity once more, but this time it was the kind of activity she welcomed. It was the kind of activity she had always wanted. As the sun dipped lower, Rose made her way outside to join the new tenants. They were crouched near the flower beds, working with their young children to plant bulbs for the winter. Rose could see the warmth in their smiles as they shared the work, the laughter that echoed across the yard, the same way it had when her own family was here, before everything had fractured. She walked over to them, offering a gentle nod of approval. "These will bloom next spring, won't they?" she asked, her voice soft, but filled with the joy of seeing something new take root. The father, David, smiled up at her. "Yes, Mrs. Taylor, they'll bloom, just like everything else here." Rose looked around at the yard, the trees, the flowers. It was all hers again, but in a different way. It wasn't about ownership anymore, it was about living. Living fully. Living without the shadow of manipulation or fear. That evening, as the light softened and the air grew cooler, Rose sat on the back porch with Paulina, a glass of wine in hand. The two of them had become like family over the last few months, working side by side to make sure everything was in order. Rose couldn't have done this without her. Paulina raised her glass, her smile wide and easy. "To not moving an inch," she said, her voice full of the warmth they had both earned. Rose clinked her glass against Paulina's, a small chuckle escaping her lips. To not moving an inch, she agreed. She took a slow sip, savoring the moment. As the last light of the sunset melted away, Rose couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment. This house, this space, it was hers, and always would be. It wasn't about the past anymore. It wasn't about Brian or Carla, or the manipulation they had tried to use to tear her down. It was about the future. It was about the life she was building with Eli, with the people who respected her, and with the strength she had rediscovered within herself. As the night fell, the yard was quiet once more, the stars beginning to emerge in the sky above. The world outside felt vast and open, and for the first time, Rose didn't feel small. She felt like she could stand in this place, in this home, and take it all in. Because they had said she should move. And so, she had moved them out entirely. And it had been the best decision she ever made.